What happens when the biggest online store in Russia starts burning to the ground, one warehouse at a time? Something strange is happening inside Russia right now, and almost nobody outside the country is talking about it. A company bigger than most people realize is quietly collapsing under fire, and the smoke from its warehouses can be seen from space. Before we go further, if you want to see exactly how this crisis unfolded day by day, hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell, because this story is moving fast, and you do not want to miss what happens next. And if this video keeps you hooked, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep bringing you stories nobody else is covering. Now let's get into it. There is a company in Russia called Wildberries. If you have never heard of it, think of it as Russia's version of Amazon. It is massive. It sells clothes, electronics, home goods, tools, groceries, almost everything a household could need. Millions of Russians order from it every single day. It employs close to 100,000 people. It operates more than 200 logistics centers scattered across the country, covering a jaw-dropping 5.5 million square meters of warehouse space. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the size of 700 football fields, all packed with shelves, conveyor belts, and workers rushing to get packages out the door. For years, Wildberries was seen as untouchable. It was a symbol of everyday Russian life continuing on, no matter what was happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. People could still order a new pair of shoes. They could still get their groceries delivered. Life, on the surface, looked normal. That illusion is now falling apart. Over the last few weeks, Ukraine has launched a campaign unlike anything we have seen so far in this war. Instead of hitting the front lines, instead of targeting tanks or trenches, Ukrainian forces turned their attention to something nobody expected: Russia's internal supply chain. And the results have been staggering. In a matter of days, 10 of the most important Wildberries logistics hubs were hit by drone strikes. Not grazed, not lightly damaged. Hit hard enough to knock them out of action. Fires broke out. Roofs collapsed. Entire buildings that once held millions of dollars worth of goods turned into piles of ash and twisted metal. And here is the part that should really make you pause. The weapon Ukraine used to do all of this is not some multi-million-dollar missile system. It is a drone called the FP-1, built by a Ukrainian company called Firepoint. Each one costs around $55,000. That is less than the price of a decent house in some cities. Yet these cheap, relatively simple machines, with a range of over 1,600 kilometers, managed to wipe out close to 10% of one of Russia's largest logistics networks in about a week. Think about that math for a second. $55,000 against a facility that might be worth tens of millions. This is what people mean when they talk about asymmetric warfare. You do not need to match your enemy dollar for dollar or missile for missile. You just need to find the weak point and hit it precisely, again and again, until the whole system starts to buckle. And it did buckle. Estimates now put the total economic damage from this strike campaign at close to $3 billion. $3 billion from an enemy spending a fraction of that to make it happen. But the money is only part of the story. The real story is what happened to the people inside those buildings when the drones started coming. Picture this. You are a warehouse worker in Russia, somewhere far from what you thought was a war zone. You go to work every day thinking you are safe because you are not a soldier, you are not near the front line, you're just packing boxes and scanning barcodes. Then one day, an alarm goes off. Not a fire drill, a real one, and you hear it, that low buzzing hum in the sky that everyone in this war has learned to fear. Then an explosion, then smoke pouring through the ceiling vents. That is not a hypothetical. That has now happened over and over again at Wildberries facilities across Russia. Workers have been filmed sprinting out of buildings in a panic, phones in hand, filming the flames eating through the roof of the place where they worked just minutes earlier. Some of these videos have gone viral inside Russia itself, spreading faster than the authorities can control the narrative around them. And here is something that should tell you everything about how deep this fear has gone. In one video that spread widely, a Wildberries worker was asked how they felt about what was happening. Their answer was not about the war in some abstract sense. It was direct anger, aimed at their own government. They said they were disappointed in their own authorities because they let this happen. Not the enemy, their own leaders. That is a dangerous sentence for any government to hear from its own workers. Think about the psychology of that moment for a second. War, for most of these workers, used to be something that happened on a screen, something you saw on the news, something happening far away, to soldiers, in places with names you only half remembered. It was never supposed to reach the warehouse down the road where you clock in every morning at 8. It was never supposed to be the reason your coworker breaks down crying because the section where she has worked for 3 years just went up in flames. That gap between what war is supposed to feel like and what it now actually feels like, for these workers, is exactly why this story matters so much. It is the moment abstract news becomes personal fear. And fear like that does not stay contained inside one warehouse. It spreads through group chats, through family dinners, through whispered conversations at bus stops. Every burned building becomes a story that 100 more people hear about within hours, whether the government wants them to or not. Let's talk about where exactly these strikes hit, because the geography tells its own story. It started near Moscow. A major facility in Elektrostal, roughly 60 kilometers from the Russian capital, was one of the first to suffer serious structural damage. Around the same time, a logistics base in the Tambov region was hit hard enough to shut down completely, indefinitely. Then came a night strike on a massive complex that employed about 4,500 workers, a facility so large that disabling it sent shockwaves through the local economy of the surrounding town. From there, the strikes did not stop. They spread south toward Krasnodar and Novorossiysk, hitting sorting centers that fed goods into southern Russia. Then they moved north toward St. Petersburg, striking a massive facility in the Shushry district. Ukraine even reached into occupied Crimea, hitting a logistics base in Simferopol, sending a clear message that no region, not even the annexed peninsula, was considered off-limits. One of the most devastating strikes hit the Ryazan region, an area that also happens to host oil refineries important to Russia's fuel production. The fire there was so intense that the facility was essentially wiped off the operational map. By the time you add it all up, open source estimates suggest that over 500,000 square meters of warehouse space was either completely destroyed or damaged beyond any practical use. That is over 500,000 square meters of storage gone in the span of just a few weeks. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. How does a country like Ukraine, fighting a much larger and better funded enemy, manage to pull off something this precise across such a wide stretch of territory, hitting exactly the right targets at exactly the right time? The answer is intelligence. Real, detailed, patient intelligence gathering. Someone had to map out where these warehouses were. Someone had to understand which ones mattered most, which ones were carrying the most valuable or most militarily useful cargo, and which ones had the weakest defenses. This did not happen by accident. This was the result of a long, quiet process of watching, tracking, and waiting for the right moment to strike. And there is a detail here that is almost impossible to ignore. Just days before the first wave of attacks, Wildberries quietly updated its contract with sellers on the platform. Buried in that update was a new clause treating drone strikes as what is called force majeure, essentially a legal way of saying the company would not be held responsible if a war-related event disrupted deliveries. Within days of that clause being added, the attacks began. Coincidence? Maybe, but it is the kind of coincidence that makes you wonder who saw this coming and how far in advance. There is something almost chilling about that kind of quiet precision. War is usually loud. It announces itself with headlines, with troop movements, with dramatic footage of front lines shifting back and forth. This campaign was different. It moved like a shadow, gathering information for weeks or months before a single drone ever left the ground. By the time the first explosion hit Elektrostal, the groundwork had already been laid, invisible to almost everyone, including, it seems, the very company whose buildings were about to become targets. If you are enjoying this breakdown so far, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me where you are watching this from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and it helps this video reach more people who need to see it. And if you have not liked the video yet, now is a great time. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells me you want more videos like this one. Let's talk about why Russia has struggled so badly to stop any of this. Russia has some of the most advanced air defense systems in the world. The S-300 and S-400 are famous names in military circles, expensive, sophisticated, built to knock enemy aircraft and missiles out of the sky. But here is the problem. Those systems were built to fight other advanced military hardware. They were not designed to be the primary defense against a swarm of small, low-flying, relatively cheap drones showing up in unpredictable locations across a country the size of a continent. Every time one of those expensive interceptor missiles is fired at a $55,000 drone, Russia is losing the financial exchange badly. It is like using a sports car to chase down a bicycle. Yes, you might win the race, but you are burning far more fuel and money than the situation calls for. And you cannot do that forever, especially not across 200 separate facilities spread from the Moscow region all the way to Crimea. There is also a much simpler problem. You cannot put a state-of-the-art air defense battery around every single warehouse in the country. It is not physically possible, and it is not financially possible either. Some Russian officials and business owners have floated the idea of stretching protective netting over these massive complexes, something that might catch or deflect incoming drones. But when you are talking about buildings that cover hundreds of thousands of square meters, the cost and the sheer scale of covering that much space with netting becomes almost a fantasy. It sounds simple on paper. In reality, it is nearly impossible to execute at this scale, fast enough to matter. Even electronic jamming, which has worked against some drone types earlier in this war, is running into trouble here. Many of the newer Ukrainian drones use inertial navigation and digital terrain mapping to find their targets. In simple terms, that means they do not rely purely on GPS signals that can be jammed. They can essentially read the landscape below them and navigate using landmarks. The same rough idea as a very advanced version of following a map by sight. Jamming the sky above does not stop a drone that is finding its own way using the ground beneath it. This is a hard lesson for any military to learn, and it is one that Russia is learning in real time, in front of its own people. For decades, air defense doctrine was built around stopping fast, high-value targets, fighter jets, cruise missiles, ballistic warheads. Nobody designed a national defense grid expecting to fend off waves of small, slow, cheap drones aimed at shopping warehouses. That mismatch between old assumptions and new reality is exactly what Ukraine appears to be exploiting, patiently and deliberately, one strike at a time. So you have a defense system built for a different kind of war, facing a threat it was never designed to stop, spread across a target list that is simply too large and too spread out to protect all at once. Wildberry's co-founder Tatiana Kim has publicly said that the company's facilities are protected under what she called standard industrial air defense protocols. But independent analysts, looking at the situation, see something very different. They describe these facilities as, in blunt terms, soft targets, civilian-looking buildings with essentially no meaningful defense against a determined drone campaign. That gap between what officials are claiming and what analysts are seeing on the ground is exactly where this story gets uncomfortable for Moscow. Now let's talk about the part of this story that goes far beyond broken buildings and burned goods, because there is a claim here that changes everything. Ukraine has stated clearly and repeatedly that these strikes were never really about hitting an ordinary retail company. President Zelensky himself has said that the facilities targeted were directly involved in supplying navigation equipment and drone components to the Russian military. In other words, according to Kiev, this was never simply an attack on where Russians buy their household goods. This was an attack on a hidden supply line feeding Russia's war machine. And there is evidence that supports at least part of that claim. Independent researchers looking into what was actually being sold on the platform found listings for items you would not expect to see on an ordinary shopping site. Fiber optic cable used in modern drone guidance systems, drone flight controllers, military-grade ballistic vests. Some of these listings reportedly even carried labels suggesting they had been tested in actual combat conditions. Shortly after the attacks began drawing international attention, that specific category of listings quietly disappeared from the platform. The products did not vanish entirely, according to reports. They were simply folded back into other, more ordinary-looking sections of the site, spread out so they would not stand out as clearly as a dedicated military supply section would. If this picture is accurate, it puts Russia in an incredibly difficult position, because now the choice is not simple anymore. Do you pull air defense systems away from the actual front line, where soldiers desperately need protection in order to guard warehouses full of commercial goods deep inside your own territory? Or do you leave those warehouses exposed and risk losing a supply line that troops on the ground may be quietly depending on? There is no comfortable answer to that question. And that is exactly the kind of dilemma that keeps military planners up at night. Unsurprisingly, the Kremlin has firmly denied any connection between Wildberries and the war effort. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters plainly that the company's facilities have nothing to do with military supply chains. Legal experts have also started examining a more complicated question: whether striking a facility that may contain a mixture of civilian and military use goods is something international law, specifically rules connected to the Geneva Conventions, would consider a legitimate target or not. That is a debate that will likely continue for a long time, without a clean, universally accepted answer. But whatever the legal arguments eventually conclude, one fact remains impossible to argue away. The warehouses are burning, the deliveries are delayed, and whatever was or was not being shipped through those facilities, the flow of goods through them has been seriously disrupted. We are only halfway through understanding just how deep this crisis goes, so if you want to see how Russia is scrambling to respond, and whether their solution actually has any chance of working, stay with me, because it gets even more interesting from here. And hey, if you have made it this far, that tells me you care about understanding this war beyond just headlines. So consider sharing this video with one person who you think would find this as fascinating as you do. It genuinely makes a difference for a channel like this one. So how is Russia actually trying to fix this mess? The most talked about plan right now is relocation. Essentially, move as much of the vulnerable logistics operation as possible outside the reach of Ukrainian drones entirely. And the country everyone is looking at for this is Kazakhstan, a close neighbor and ally of Russia, sitting just far enough away that it would theoretically be outside the danger zone. On paper, this sounds like a smart move. Get the warehouses out of drone range, keep the business running, keep the shelves stocked. In practice, it runs into an enormous problem almost immediately. Kazakhstan simply does not have anywhere near enough modern warehouse space to absorb an operation the size of Wildberries. According to regional data, Kazakhstan's entire modern logistics footprint totals somewhere around 1.9 million square meters. And of that limited space, only about 6% is currently sitting empty and available to rent. Now compare that to what Russia just lost. More than 500,000 square meters of warehouse capacity destroyed or crippled in a matter of weeks. Kazakhstan's entire available vacant logistics space cannot come close to replacing what was lost. Not even close. It is like trying to refill an ocean using a garden hose. The intention might be there, but the physical capacity simply is not. This puts Wildberries, and by extension the Russian government, in an incredibly tight spot. They cannot fully repair what has been lost inside Russia, because the threat is still active and unpredictable. And they cannot fully relocate abroad because there is not enough available space to move into. They are stuck between two options, and neither one solves the actual problem. There is another layer to this that makes the situation even more politically sensitive. Wildberries recently went through a major restructuring, merging under close supervision from senior Kremlin officials with one of Russia's largest advertising operators. That merger effectively pulled the company deeper into direct state influence and control, which means this is no longer just a private business crisis. When a company this closely tied to the state starts losing billions of dollars and struggling to protect its own infrastructure, that failure reflects directly back on the government overseeing it. And even if some version of the relocation plan eventually happens, there's a hidden cost that rarely gets mentioned in the headlines. Moving major distribution hubs outside the country means longer delivery routes back into Russia. Longer routes mean higher transportation costs. Higher transportation costs eventually mean higher prices for ordinary Russian shoppers, the same people who are already watching their daily lives get disrupted by this war in ways they never expected. So even the supposed solution comes with a quiet, longer-term price tag that most people will not notice right away, but will absolutely feel over time. Now here's where this story connects to something much bigger than one company's warehouses. At the exact same time these logistics strikes were happening, Ukraine was also hitting something else deep inside Russian territory: oil refineries. These simultaneous strikes reportedly pushed Russian fuel production down to its lowest level in more than 2 decades. 2 entirely different industries hit at the same time, both critical to how Russia funds and fuels its war effort. This is not random. This looks like a coordinated strategy aimed at a very specific goal, slowly draining Russia's ability to sustain a long war, not by fighting battle after battle on the front line, but by quietly dismantling the economic engine that keeps the war running in the background. Fuel production and internal logistics are not glamorous targets. They do not make for dramatic frontline footage, but they are the plumbing that keeps everything else functioning. Cut the plumbing, and eventually everything upstream starts to suffer, even if it takes time to become visible. Russia is a massive country. For most of modern history, that size has been treated as one of its greatest strengths: deep, defensible territory. Room to retreat, room to hide critical infrastructure far from any potential enemy. That is the old idea of strategic depth, and it has shaped military thinking for generations. But this story shows how much that old idea is being challenged. With drones that can fly over 1,600 kilometers, guided by their own onboard navigation systems, distance stops being the safety net it used to be. A warehouse 60 kilometers from Moscow, a facility way up near St. Petersburg, a base out in occupied Crimea, none of them were truly out of reach. The size of Russia, instead of being a shield, has almost become a liability because there is simply too much ground to defend, and too many soft, civilian-looking targets scattered across it. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire Wildberries story. It is not really about a shopping website. It is about what happens when a country's everyday, ordinary infrastructure, the roads, the warehouses, the fuel refineries, the systems people rely on without ever thinking twice about them, suddenly become part of the battlefield. And once that line gets crossed, it is very hard to go back to pretending that a war happening somewhere else does not touch daily life at home. We are approaching the end of this story, but before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you have been following this war closely, does this shift, hitting supply chains and civilian infrastructure instead of just the front line, change how you think about where this conflict is heading? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I am genuinely curious what you think. And if this video taught you something you did not know before today, do one more thing for me. Share it with someone who still thinks this war is only happening far away on a battlefield. This story proves that is not entirely true anymore. So where does this leave us? Wildberries is still standing, technically. The website still works. Orders are still being placed. But underneath that surface of normal daily business, something fundamental has cracked. Nearly 10% of its logistics capacity gone in about a week. roughly $3 billion in damage, tens of thousands of workers who now go to work wondering if today is the day they hear that drone alarm again, small business owners across the country watching their inventory, and possibly their entire livelihoods, sitting inside buildings that might be the next target, and Moscow caught in an impossible position. Protect the warehouses and pull air defenses away from soldiers who need them on the front line. Leave the warehouses exposed and watch the economic pressure keep building, week after week, strike after strike. There's no clean way out of this for Russia, at least not right now. The relocation plan to Kazakhstan cannot fully replace what has been lost. The air defense systems were never built to fight a war against $55,000 drones flying low and steady toward ordinary-looking buildings. And the anger from workers, the kind you heard in that leaked video, disappointed in our own authorities, is not something that fades quietly. It lingers. It spreads. It changes how people feel about the people running their country. What started as a handful of drone strikes on a handful of warehouses has turned into something much bigger. A live demonstration that in this new era of warfare, you do not always need to break through a front line to bring a country to its knees. Sometimes all you need is patience, precise intelligence, a fleet of relatively cheap drones, and the willingness to target the quiet, unprotected systems that an entire nation depends on without ever thinking twice about them. Russia built an empire of convenience, warehouses stretching from Moscow to Crimea, delivering packages to millions of doorsteps every single day. That same empire is now on fire, quite literally, and nobody inside Russia seems to have a fast enough answer for how to put it out. Think about how strange that sentence would have sounded just a couple of years ago. A war fought with tanks and trenches, reaching all the way into the aisles of an online shopping warehouse. A soldier on the front line and a delivery worker in Moscow now connected by the same invisible threat of risk, even though one of them signed up for combat and the other one just wanted a paycheck. That is the world this war has quietly created, whether anyone intended it or not. And it raises a question that stretches far beyond Russia and Ukraine. If a country's entire commercial backbone, its warehouses, its shipping routes, its everyday retail infrastructure, can become a legitimate military target once it starts quietly serving a war effort, then every modern economy watching this unfold has to ask itself an uncomfortable question. How exposed is our own supply chain? How much of what we consider ordinary daily life is actually resting on infrastructure nobody thought to protect, because nobody imagined it would ever need protecting in the first place? The next few months will tell us whether this was a temporary setback Russia can absorb and rebuild from, or the beginning of a much deeper economic wound that keeps bleeding long after the smoke clears. Either way, one thing is already certain. This war has crossed a new line, straight into the everyday lives of ordinary people who thought they were far away from any of it, and that, more than any single number or any single burned warehouse, might be the most important part of this entire story. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you, genuinely, for sticking with me through the whole thing. If this story opened your eyes to a side of this war you had not seen before, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one, because there is a lot more happening behind the scenes of this conflict that deserves your attention. Let me know in the comments what part of this story surprised you the most. I will see you in the next video.